Peace, everybody. My name is Toney Jackson, and I am here at the amazing HACPAC in downtown Hackensack for Black History Month with an incredible interview today, speaking with educator, one of my colleagues, pop culture historian, Caseen Gaines. We're going to be talking about his new book, Footnotes, which dives into the history of the Broadway smash Shuffle Along. Now, we are in here in this building alone. Aside from Caseen, now Greg and Frank, looks like they're all the way back there in the booth. And we have plenty of space between us. Because we've taken these precautions, I'm going to go ahead and take the mask off. Thank you for continuing to wear yours whenever it's needed. So I'm talking to Caseen Gaines, and Case, your book explores the incredible history and the story not only of the show, but of the creators of the show. And since this is Black History Month, every time that I jump into a different page in the book, every time I learn a little bit more about the history of the show, I feel like there's another chapter of Black history that I'm opening up. Can you talk a little bit about what makes the show so revolutionary?
Sure. So Shuffle Along is a show that debuted on Broadway in 1921. And when I'm saying it's on Broadway, it actually was on 63rd Street, which is outside of the theater district, but because they were able to get a certain ticket price, it qualified it for Broadway. And what was really so revolutionary was it was the first all-Black production to really succeed. It ran for over 400 performances, which was almost unheard of at that time. It brought syncopation to Broadway, and it started the careers of Josephine Baker, Paul Robeson, and Nat King Cole was actually a part of the orchestra of this Broadway show.
Amazing.
So it really was a groundbreaking production, and over the century that since its debut, it really sort of became forgotten a little bit by history. So the book really looks to reinstate their proper place in not only theater history, but also entertainment history.
It's so important to revisit that. And you also speak in the book about the 2015, not a revival, but the 2015 version, the George C. Wolfe version of the show, that also spoke a little bit about the history behind the scenes of getting the show made. Do you have a similar feeling about the way that show ended and the way that Shuffle Along ended back in the 20s?
So I actually saw that production the day before it closed with a good friend of mine, and we were part of this theater workshop, and it was so bizarre because we had a talk back after the production, and because we were there after the audience already emptied out, there were people taking the merchandise down from the stands. It felt funereal almost, actually. I've been around for lots of closing night performances of shows, and it felt a lot like that. There's a sort of joy that comes with recognizing what you've done, but also a kind of sadness that it's coming to a close. And so we had the opportunity to speak with people like Brian Stokes Mitchell, who amazing Tony Award winning performer, and they were visibly upset and audibly upset that this show that looked to reestablish this history was meeting a premature ending. And I was sort of left with this feeling that a great injustice was being done. Audra McDonald, who starred in that production, had never heard of Shuffle Along before she was in it. She is still the reigning person with the most Tony Awards in terms of performer. And so for her to be an amazing Black actress and not know of this show just seemed to highlight how important it was to make sure that this show wasn't once again forgotten. So like a lot of people, I went home and I went down the rabbit hole of the internet and realized that there was such a rich history, not only of this production, but really of the people that were responsible for it, that were all born a generation removed from slavery. They were also college-educated people. 3 out of 4 of them were college-educated. It was just a phenomenal story. They were war heroes. So I really was interested not only in telling the story of the show, but also of the men that were responsible for this show.
Absolutely. And speaking about theater and speaking about education, as a theater director, as a producer, as an actor, and also as an educator, it made me wonder about what you might think about the ability of art, such as this, to not only educate others, but also to spark inquiry. And so one of the questions that I had was, how much knowledge of this did you come into it with? It's so interesting that you mentioned that about Audrey McDonald, she is Black Broadway. She's Broadway, period. And to have this be, I was going to say a footnote, to have this be something that she was unfamiliar with is really striking. Can you speak a little bit about the ability of the arts and the importance of the arts and theater as something that can educate and also spark inquiry?
I think about this a lot as someone who works with drama students all the time, that when we think about history and Broadway history, we think about the classics being things like South Pacific, being things like Rodgers and Hammerstein, Carousel. These are all the classics. Shuffle Along predates almost all of those shows that we establish as being a part of the theater canon. And so I've really been wrestling a lot with how we educate people about the arts, because I think about all of the people like Audrey McDonald that went to theater school and went to programs and went and auditioned singing songs from the Great American Songbook that were not songs written by people who looked like her, when there were songs that existed by people like her. The song I'm Just Wild About Harry, which is just sort of a standard, is a song that actually comes from Shuffle Along. It's a song that everyone knows. Maybe you've heard it by Daffy Duck or Michigan J. Frog or something like that. But everyone's familiar with that song, and you don't necessarily associate it with Black performers and Black writers specifically. So, art is funny because in a lot of ways it reflects society, but it also, I think, is more powerful in shaping society. And so when you have a show like Shuffle Along, which essentially becomes almost erased, you end up losing something for all of those performers that came about since 1921 that don't have this as part of their history and a part of their lexicon.
That's really powerful, especially when you talk about harkening back to classics and in any medium, especially as educators thinking about the books that are in our classrooms and what we consider to be classic. Generally speaking, I feel like classic often refers to, it's going to be a book that is likely by a white author. And hearing about Shuffle Along and hopefully Shuffle Along making its way back into not just relevance, but popularity, I wonder about books in the classroom, if you think something similar should be happening there. Should we revisit classics by Black authors? Should we try to find more diverse authors now and include those books into what we're teaching in the curriculum now?
I mean, I think really the argument is we should be looking at a more holistic view of art that comes out of, or influential art. I think that's the more important thing. I'm sort of less concerned, I think, about trying to make sure that there are a certain number of Black texts or texts by Black authors or Latinx authors in a classroom, and more saying we need to rethink what is important, and we need to find more entry points for people, and in this case, students, because we're talking about being in the classroom, to connect. The reason why a show like Shuffle Along really worked for so many people is it reflected Black culture back to not only Black people, but also white people. There were lots of white people that came to the show and really enjoyed it. In fact, they added a midnight performance of Shuffle Along because they wanted other performers to have access to it. So when you think about text in the classroom, there are works by Alice Walker, certainly August Wilson, that are just as classical, just as relevant as something like Catcher in the Rye, but we don't really view it in the same way. We view it as sort of niche or different. So I think it just requires all of us to open our horizons and really think about the great tapestry of America.
There's a great story at the beginning of the book, and you talk about the fear that the creators felt when a certain scene was going to happen. And because of how revolutionary the scene was, it was going to be depicting something that had not been shown on stage, that they felt the audiences may not be ready for. The fear that they felt. I want you to talk a little bit about what happened in that scene, why it was something that they would have that palpable fear of, and then is that something that still exists for Black creatives? Do you think there still is a fear of tackling something that may be taboo or being the first to do that?
So the scene that you're talking about refers to the two romantic leads in the show singing a love duet. And this was, in 1921, completely revolutionary. It was completely taboo. This idea that there would be two Black people on stage express genuine affection for each other and love for each other, and it not be comedy. You know, you can have sort of hypersexualized people on stage. You could have mammies on stage that love children. You could have sort of comedic love, but to have actual genuine affection was a completely taboo thing. And in fact, when Shuffle Along was being developed, the editor of Variety ran into the performers, who were also the writers of the show, and said, you know, you're dead in the water because white women in particular will never go see a show with Black women on stage. They just won't pay Broadway prices to see Black women on stage. That's not what they will consider to be entertainment. You know, this is in 1921. But the audience actually accepted the show and accepted this moment and just went along for the ride. You know, it's important. I'll get to the meat of your question, but it's important to sort of put into context that Shuffle Along was really the amalgamation of both these two musicians, Eubie Blake and Noble Sissle, who always performed in tuxedos. They were very polished. They were very suave and debonair, and it was their music merged with these blackface comedians, Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles, who really trafficked in antebellum humor. I mentioned they performed in blackface. And so while the show was very progressive, particularly from a musical standpoint, they certainly trafficked in humor that would be more palpable to white audiences. And so because this love plot was sort of couched in between all of these other elements, it was easy for people to not turn against the performers that were on stage. I mean, I think this is still a dance that a lot of people of color do. You know, I think when they are the first to be in a certain sphere, and it's amazing to me that we still have the first in so many spheres. You know, someone like Vice President Harris right now is the first woman of color, of South Asian descent, of Black descent, to be in that role. When you're talking about the first, really what you're saying is prior to this moment, there were none. I mean, that's really what we don't focus on enough. We get a lot of celebratory words about the first, but we don't talk about this long history then where there was no one doing it. And so, you know, as long as we're still breaking barriers, and as long as people are still the first to do something, it's always scary. It's always nervous to put yourself, it always makes you nervous to be the first person to go out and do something like that.
So I want to jump right on that and then walk backwards a little bit. Do you think that Vice President Harris, do you think that she feels a huge weight in knowing that she is the first? And do you think that the impact is clear to her, the impact that does and could have?
I'm sure it does, but I think it's funny. I'm sure you're aware of the impact, but I think the other part of it is you're a person doing a job. You know, these were performers, they were writers, they were entertainers, and they were entertaining. They were going out to do what, you know, their God-given talents were on stage every night, 8 nights a week. And so I'm sure there's a component, whether you are Kamala Harris, whether you're Barack Obama, when you're the first person in that space to have an awareness of that, but also at the end of the day, you have a job to do. And that's really how you ensure that there is a second. That's how you ensure that there are people that come after you by doing a strong and solid job at the job that you're tasked with.
And for these creators, in that moment, they knew that they were doing something that had not been done before. Do you believe, because you've looked at the lives of all four, right? Lyons, Miller, Blake, and Sissle. You've looked at the lives of all of them deeply. Were they aware of the impact that they were having and the importance of the work that they had done with Shuffle Along?
It's a really good question because I don't think they were aware in real time. I think it was very important to them. You have to remember, this is before talking pictures. This is 1921. This is before talking pictures. This is before television. Of course you had cinema, but it wasn't Hollywood in the way that we think about it now and the way that it is now. And so if you were a musician or you were an actor, the peak of your career was going to be to get to Broadway. So they were primarily interested in getting in front of as many audiences as possible, and also, in a practical sense, making as much money as possible. I mean, that was their bread and butter. And so what they ended up sort of spawning, I don't think that they had an awareness until they had attempts at reviving the show in 1933 and 1952, when they had the ability to sort of look back and realize how much Broadway had changed in a lot of positive ways because of what they had done. And in some ways, while they had opened up the door was sort of being closed behind them without them realizing it in some ways. So it's fascinating. But, when you talk about Shuffle Along and the sort of coattails it had, my favorite story is Langston Hughes, who literally chose to come to New York and go to Columbia because he was in Cleveland and wanted to go see Shuffle Along. And that was his excuse for wanting to go to Columbia. His father actually didn't want him to go to Columbia. He had an opportunity to go overseas for school and study abroad right out of the gate as a freshman. And he said, no, I'm going to New York. And that was really what he did. So, Langston Hughes credits Shuffle Along with kickstarting the Harlem Renaissance. And if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. I'm going to go with that.
I think that is so incredible. And I think it's so incredible to say, for something to be considered as something that kickstarted a movement like the Harlem Renaissance, because the Harlem Renaissance is discussed often, right? And the impact that it had. And we look at all the figures who came from it. I want to ask why Shuffle Along is not mentioned more, because even you write in the book that James Weldon Johnson, was a fan. There's numerous folks who went on to be known for incredible things, but Shuffle Along stayed back. Is there another reason why Shuffle Along is not mentioned more now?
I think in large part it's because of the blackface humor. And I think it's really interesting. When I was growing up, I liked the Little Rascals comedies, the Our Gang comedies. And there was this rumor that I don't think was true at the time that Bill Cosby had purchased all the rights for the Our Gang comedies and, had taken them off TV and because they trafficked in racial humor. That's certainly one way to view the show, to view those shorts. Another way is it was a bunch of kids that were of different races that played together in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and were genuine friends and in each other's homes. And certainly there was a power dynamic there and there was a racial dynamic there because of the time period, but in some ways it was incredibly progressive for the period. I think that what happened with Shuffle Along, and particularly in 1952 when they were staging this revival, which Pearl Bailey was supposed to star in, she was attached to the project before she saw the script. And when she saw it, she made a big public declaration that she wasn't going to do it, and she sort of denounced the show and said, she doesn't do darky humor. She doesn't think that the show should be remembered. And I'm not saying that it's been forgotten because of her specifically, but that attitude that dark parts of our past should be forgotten, should be tucked away, that really sort of complicated the legacy of Shuffle Along. While I think there was an incentive for people in the theater industry who were white to sort of cast it aside and co-opt parts of it for their gain, I think for reasons of racial justice and equality, there was also a concerted effort from a lot of Black intellectuals and thought leaders to say, Shuffle Along, Step and Fetch It, all of these sorts of aspects of trailblazers for Black people, we're just going to pretend like that didn't happen. And, this is something that the creators really wrestled with later in their lives, because while they were pioneers, they sort of became pariahs. And U.B. Blake in particular was very sort of indignant later in his life, saying all of these performers that don't want to hear the songs from Shuffle Along wouldn't even be on Broadway if it weren't for the doors that we had opened for them, all of these years ago. So it's a complicated thing. And I think for Black people in particular, the concessions that one has to make in order to enter the mainstream, certainly 100 years ago and arguably even still today, more often than not kind of put a little bit of an asterisk or a little bit of a blemish on the things that you've created. So it's challenging in that aspect.
And speaking of the Little Rascals, my dad was a big fan, even though he's not a big fan of television. I think about the characters like Buckwheat and Farina and Stymie, and I think about them much in the same way that you're talking about Miller and Lyons, in that they got a lot of guff for the roles that they played, especially years and years later, years and years after. Can you talk about the importance for them and the importance of characters throughout history who may have had to, or actors throughout history who may have had to take those roles?
A lot of people sort of are surprised when they learn that there were Black people who performed in blackface. And, Floyd Miller is such a fascinating character for me in the book in particular because he was an incredibly smart, educated person, went to Fisk University. He is someone who wrote all of their materials. In fact, Shuffle Along, while it's really the four of them together made this show, he really was the brainchild behind this production. He ended up writing actually for Amos and Andy later on in his life. And it's fascinating because so much of the script of the show has so much wit, and it's really so clever and so smart. But because it's at the expense of Black people, it sort of is difficult to read and difficult to hear sometimes. It is. One of the things that he would do actually when going for gigs, because he was of a lighter complexion, is he would wear blackface and he would wear gloves on his hands, and he would always make sure that his costume would have a little bit of skin show so that people might actually think that he was a white man performing in blackface because he thought he could get more money that way. And so, in a lot of ways, it's incredibly degrading that people had to do this. But also, it was sort of a way of competing for roles. It was a way of saying, okay, if a white performer is going to make a buck at my expense, I should be able to make a buck at my own expense as well. And, it is complex, it is complicated. But I think that you could certainly draw a straight line to whether it's certain forms of music, certain forms of comedy, film, different forms of entertainment where people perhaps are not considered to be the best representations of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, etc. But in some ways, it moves the needle forward. It does. And that's the thing that I always sort of remind people of. This book is a time capsule. It's really looking at 1921, but I think that you can draw pretty clear connections to a lot of things that have transpired over the course of that century that followed.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely see that line you're talking about. I think about music today, and I think about artists, hip-hop artists, who make their money on music that a lot of people will say, is glorifying all of the wrong things, or is, these are horrible stereotypes that they're perpetuating. At the same time, they are making a living based on stereotypes about them that were, that they did not create. And I feel a little bit of the same thing here. What about in terms of, in 1921 when the show came out, over the years, other Black shows started to come out as well. Did it change the view of Shuffle Along as other Black shows started to come out as well?
It did. The creators of Shuffle Along never really sought to create something that was a novelty. They just sort of wanted to make an all-Black show with Black music and Black entertainment. However, what was sort of interesting was there were subsequent shows that these creators made. So actually, Shuffle Along wasn't their only Broadway show. It was their only collaborative effort as a four-piece, as a quadrant. But there was infighting, there was all this drama that's great to read about. But ultimately, what ends up happening is each of these successive shows become less and less successful. And the reason is you can read reviews that say like, well, when Shuffle Along came out, it was the only one of its kind, but now like it's not uncommon to see people tap dancing and shimmying on stage and to see this sort of humor. And, you know, now there are 9 all black shows on Broadway. I mean, which is crazy actually just to think about for a moment. That between 1921 and 1924, there were 9 all black Broadway shows on stage at the same time. I mean, that's amazing. I mean, I don't know if that's ever happened since that window of time. But it's sort of the attitude was sort of adopted that then each of those shows was kind of like a dime a dozen, you know, and there were diminishing returns. So it's an interesting sort of thing. And I think it really raises the question in terms of what is the price that you pay for success? You know, the goal is always to open the door and have people come after you. But in doing that, sometimes what was special about your production or what was deemed special or novel sort of gets diminished in a weird sort of way.
Yes. In the book, one of my favorite stories, there's a lot of amazing stories. You tell the story of Jack Viertel, who was white and in 2002 was considering reviving Shuffle Along. And knowing that there was this history, knowing that there was the issues with representation, the minstrelsy, he reached out to August Wilson and was looking for some advice, looking for his input. And Wilson essentially said, I think this is an important show. I think it's important to talk about what was pop culture. I think it's important to talk about the historical impact of this, you know, and kind of gave his blessing. But he decided not to do it. And then later, George C. Wolfe in 2015, the rest is history. When George C. Wolfe did it, as you write, he added information about putting on the show and creating the show. And you got the story behind the story, which I think is interesting. I feel like your book is kind of an inception because it's the story of the story within the story of a story.
It's an enigma wrapped in a riddle, what's the quote from JFK? Something like that, yeah.
But in saying that, I'm curious what you think it might have looked like if Viertel had put on this show in 2002 before George C. Wolfe got to it in 2015.
I think it would have been, I appreciate you bring up this moment because to me, this is sort of the great riddle of Shuffle Along and its history. How do you pay homage to a show that does not meet societal standards of what is acceptable today? You know, there has never really been a successful revival of Shuffle Along, and even when they tried to revive it in 1933 and 1952, it was never the original production. I think that's really interesting because there are all sorts of shows that have complicated moments, that have complicated songs, and are still performed in high schools across America, in community theaters across America, Broadway, and they don't cut anything. They just sort of say, this was written in the 40s, and we're going to deal with it, you know, the way it was. But there's something unique about when it's racial humor. And not only racial humor, but racial humor by Black people specifically, I think, that makes it uncomfortable to see. And August Wilson's real argument was, America really needs to see it. And they need to see it because the only way you understand where we are today is by looking at the things that Black people had to endure in order to succeed in 1921. You know, it was a really important thing, he thought, as a historical piece. How do I think it would have been received? I think it probably would have been received pretty poorly. I think it probably would have been, and I think that even if you were to still stage something like Shuffle Along, it probably would still be received kind of poorly. I think George C. Wolfe's production, which had 10 Tony nominations, it was shut out by this show, Hamilton. I'm not sure if you heard of it, but Hamilton was in the same year and it swept everything. It's a whole thing. You might want to watch it. But I think it's really begs the question as to why some things are considered acceptable and why we're able to excuse some things and why some things we won't. And that's just sort of a question that I try and leave readers with in the book.
I love that. And you kind of steer me into another question. Black creatives for a very long time and even currently are often pigeonholed in the expectation that they will tackle quote unquote Black issues. And I want to talk about you now as a writer. You've written about the pop culture spectrum, right? You've gone from Back to the Future to A Christmas Story to Shuffle Along. And I wonder your thoughts on, I'm curious about your thoughts as a writer who has such a wide lens about the difficulties of being accepted and if you ever experience those obstacles in your own experience.
I don't know if I ever really had the challenge of being accepted, but I think it's only because I was never really viewed as an author of color for the other things I've written. You know, I think that I've turned up on a number of lists in terms of like, you know, books by, you know, POCs to watch for in 2021 now, where I didn't know those lists existed, you know, prior to this book, because this book primarily is about, you know, Black artists, which I think is really sort of interesting. I don't know if I was really in the Black author club until I wrote about Black subjects, which is a whole nother thing.
Interesting.
But I think, you know, one of the things that you're bringing up in terms of the wide lens is, I think that when you are a person of color in America, you know, the mainstream culture is also your culture. You don't have the ability to sort of say, well, I'm not going to partake in that. You know, like, you know, people know, every person of color knows Sweet Caroline. I don't know if every white person knows Before I Let Go. And I'm just, you know, that's the reality. And because it is American culture, and it is in sort of the DNA of what is considered to be normal and mainstream, and things that pertain to the LGBT community, people of color, you know, those are sort of more segmented. I used to work in a music store, and we used to have like an urban cinema section of the store. And that could have ranged from Roots to Soul Plane to, I mean, like anything where people were Black on the cover, it went in that section.
Right.
It was just sort of a catch-all. And I think that that's sort of the weird thing is, you know, this book probably gets shelved on a different place in a store than my other books, even though they're all looking at entertainment, they're all looking at popular culture, they're all looking at a moment in time. There's really nothing that differentiates them except for the people on the cover. And that's its own sort of question about commercialism and all of that. that really wasn't at the heart of the question, but I think that's it raises interesting questions as to why that is.
And we're not a monolith, right? Because our interests can be that of the greater culture around us. One of my favorite websites, Black Nerd Problems. You know, we're familiar with some of the writers there.
Yes.
Speak very much about the same things without directly speaking about that. If you were to be able to interview one of the 4 creators for the show, who would that be? And can you tell me one question that you would want to ask them?
Oh, wow. I would. You know, ask me on a different day, I might have a different answer. But today, I'm going to probably say I would interview Aubrey Lyles. And the reason why, he was one of the blackface comedians. He was very much so the second person. He was not the lead person. He was happy playing second banana. He was always credited as a co-writer. He really didn't write anything. It was more a concession or more professional courtesy is what I'm trying to say. But he did something really interesting where really at the height of his career, he kind of pulled a Dave Chappelle and left America and went to Africa for a period of time and came back and had a completely different view on comedy, his place in comedy, and once he returned, had a renewed focus with his partner Floyd Miller to open a legitimate Broadway house that was going to be Black owned and operated. And unfortunately, mild spoiler alert, he died prematurely. He died in, I believe it's the end of 1932, he died. And so that dream was left unfulfilled. It was just a year or so after he came back from Africa and really was determined to do this. But I would love to know more about why he left America to go, what he was looking for in Africa, and what he found when he came back that made him more determined than ever to say Black artists should not have to depend on white producers, white theater owners, but really we're going to open the first Black Broadway theater in Manhattan, and ultimately that never happened, and there is no Black-owned theater in Manhattan.
The fact that you mentioned that he pulled a Dave Chappelle is exactly what I thought when I read that in the book. And so I really appreciate that reference, and I wonder the same thing. When you began writing this, did you know that it would come out in 2021?
I did know that it was going to come out in 2021. Initially, the idea was for it to come out in February for Black History Month, and then it just seemed like we were in the centennial of Shuffle Along, and so it seemed like the perfect moment. I did not know that it was going to come after racial uprisings and a global pandemic. It's funny because Shuffle Along was actually produced in the aftermath of the 1918 pandemic. So it was sort of bizarre. It felt at times like when I was working on it, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And it was really striking to me how so many things that were taking place 100 years ago had echoes of things that were going on still today.
Yes, that was something that rushed to mind as I was thinking about you writing it, and you spoke to that a little bit in terms of what was going on then, what's going on now. When 2020 hit and there was racial turmoil, did you think about what you were writing or what you had written in a different way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the book is better for it, and the book is fundamentally changed for it. There's this section in the book, actually, the Tulsa riot, or the Tulsa uprising, really more of a riot, was a week after Shuffle Along opened on Broadway. I mean, just for context. So really, when you're watching, there were moments where I was going to demonstrations in Hackensack, in Bergen County, and coming back to the computer to write about moments in 1919 and 1920 when Black men were lynched, by rogue actors, by terrorists, essentially. And it was really striking to see that in this landscape, there were people that were trying to do what they could in their capacity to further the race. And it's funny because Noble Sissel was the son of a preacher. And he said that his father always wanted him to be a preacher because preachers are ambassadors. They are ambassadors for Christ. They are ambassadors for the Spirit. And he said, while his father did not live to see his success with Shuffle Along, his father died feeling disappointed that he was not a minister, but ultimately he became an ambassador for the race. He became an ambassador who was 8 nights a week putting this great music in front of white audiences for the first time. He was amazingly successful overseas. In Paris, they loved him. He was deemed the greatest Negro vocalist of all time. And so there's such amazing history in this moment in America. And Shuffle Along really, I see as the nucleus, as sort of a case study for it. But the reason why the book is titled Footnotes is really because as I was writing it, I was thinking about how if we are lucky, all of our names probably get forgotten by history. But what we have done survives and what we have done lasts. And so while you may not know Shuffle Along, while you may not know the names of Flournoy Miller, Aubrey Lyles, Noble Sissel, and U.B. Blake, you certainly know the fruits of what they had sowed. And at the end of the day, that's really what matters. What matters is really the doing, because all of that other stuff fades away. We think someone like Oprah will always be remembered. Oprah will not be remembered 100 years from now. It's just not the case. There was another person who occupied a similar space like that. So Shuffle Along really became, for me, an example, not the example, of people that have been forgotten by history, by America, but still did their part to sort of put their fingerprints on the DNA of this country. And so that's why I was just so excited to tell this story. And I really feel like it was, as much as it is about 1921, it is also about 2021 and just about who we are as a people.
I think that puts a perfect cap on it. I really appreciate that in all of the conversation that we just had, there is so much story left, so many stories left within this book for people to dive into and to learn even more about this amazing show and the amazing creators. So thank you so much for taking this time with us, Case.
Thank you.
Folks, thank you for joining us as well. Not in the seats necessarily, but from home where hopefully you're comfortable. I want you to stay safe. We really appreciate the city of Hackensack for giving us this amazing opportunity in Black History Month to dive deep into our past, because we know that what's happening in our present now, along with our past, is what's going to shape our future. So thank you to the HACPAC, the city of Hackensack, our educator and author, Caseen Gaines, and thank you. Hey folks, if you would like your own signed copy of Footnotes by Caseen Gaines, we're going to give you a chance to do that. Thanks to Source Books, the publisher, they're providing 2 copies, which we're going to make available to you. Here's what you have to do. You have to be the 21st or the 102nd person. Now let me explain it. If you're the 21st person, guess what this is? It's 2021, folks, okay? 102, that's where we are right now at the HACPAC, 102 State Street here in Hackensack. So be the 21st or the 102nd person to like this video, share it, and then send a screenshot to gliosi@hackensack.org, GLIOSI@hackensack.org, and you could be the recipient of Footnotes.